Okay, I think we'll get started now. Welcome everyone. So glad that you've joined us for this event. We've been going from strength to strength this term, and we're sure that this event is going to be like a perfect ending to a really successful holiday term. Final reminder, if everyone could turn their mics and cameras off, just so it's not a disturbance or disrupting the conversation. And if you have any questions throughout the discussion, feel free to type them into the chat, and then we'll visit them at the end during our Q&A session, where you can turn your cameras on and ask our speakers if you'd like to in person. Okay, moving on to introducing the two speakers that we're so thrilled to have tonight. Firstly, Vanessa Stovall is an independent artist and interdisciplinary scholar of classical studies. On the art side of things, she's a professional harpist, and she composes music, poetry, lyric, and drama for the stage. On the scholarly side of things, she studies ancient myth and music with a focus on the lyre and its transmission of myth. She received her Bachelor of Arts at the Evergreen State College and Master of Arts at Columbia University, doing research on Greek tragedy. As a society, we were really excited to read Vanessa's piece about Sappho and WAP and the transmission of certain elements of erotic poetry and love poetry through time. That was a really amazing piece that sparked a lot of great discussion. So hopefully we'll hear some of those nuggets of wisdom that you had in that piece, Vanessa. And our second speaker, Jermaine Bryant, is a PhD student and presidential fellow in the classics department at Princeton University. In 2019, he received a BA in classics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His scholarly interests primarily focus on the literature and social history of the late Roman Republic and early Principate, with particular attention to ideas of civic grief, trauma, reconciliation following the civil wars in the early Augustan period, especially as reflected by the Elegists. A longtime lover of hip hop, he's recently published the piece Stakes is High, Roman Elegy, Hip Hop, and the Ovid movie, another one that we loved as a committee. And this is on how readings of hip hop form and culture can help inform readings of Latin elegy and vice versa. He's also recently lectured on using hip hop in the classics classroom. So without further ado, Jermaine and Vanessa, question for you both. Do you think there's something intrinsic to the rhythms of poetic meter that speak to us as people, something that is shared by ancient poetry and hip hop today?
Well, I'll dive in first. Absolutely is the short answer I think I would give. But more deeply, I think that rhythm in and of itself is just deeply intrinsic to human life and human behavior, even just our development as a species. And I think poetry is just a way of trying to sort of achieve and understand that rhythm, especially as we go through life and try to make sense of it in different ways. And part of this is I study a lot in studying ancient myth and music and seeing where a lot of those intersections come to play. But also it's so much more broader beyond classics too. I mean, there's just so many different world mythologies that rely upon music, upon rhythm and meter and things of that nature in order to help us make understanding of the world, but also just myth making, for more broadly groups and cultures and societies, but also self-mythologizing, which I think is one of the bigger sort of undercurrents of hip hop in general. And so that's where I see a lot of the links coming forward.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Vanessa. And Jermaine, if you'd like to answer this first one.
Yeah. So the origins of rhythmic poetry is not is by no means my specialty, but I mean, I do think that it's worth noting that in the Greek and Latin traditions that, you know, poetry and metrical poetry, we start to see it developing before prose happens. I'm not exactly sure why this is. It might have to do with if you're trying to sort of codify and record speech verbatim in a society that is not necessarily literary, or a lot of the people aren't literate. It's easier if you have a rhyme scheme or a metrical pattern that you can follow and remember. It's like the reason that we have jingles. I do think that I would separate this from what happens with hip hop. Hip hop is not the first English poetry that comes into existence, and it's not the first Black American, African American poetry that exists, and it coincides with a musical development of mixing, and you have these DJs who now suddenly have access to this mixing technology that is the most advanced that the world has ever seen. It's completely revolutionized music, and it's surprisingly accessible. And you have these MCs at clubs and things like that, essentially chanting rhythmically over it in order to sort of hype up the DJ, which is why in a lot of early hip hop, the DJ name is the one that comes first. It's Eric B as president, by Eric B and Rakim, not Rakim and Eric B. And then eventually you start to see this tradition, and the people in this tradition say, oh, our language can do more. Our language can do more. And eventually the language starts to eclipse the music, but they develop together. I'm sure Vanessa, as the more creative of the two of us, has more to say about this than I do. But I think it's very interesting to see the connections and also see the differences. And I certainly think that there's something about rhythms and meters that get under our skin and embed themselves inside of us.
Actually, to follow up a little bit on that last point, I would almost even take it farther. I would say that rhythms and meters are one of the most, like, the easiest ways for us to remember things. Like, they are their own sort of like epistemic, like, knowledge production site. And I think it's actually becomes very, very hard to remember things when they aren't in meter. And this is sort of one of my deeper, I think, arguments I'm making about stories and myths in general, as they just tend to be one of the easiest ways to encode information to each other and to pass it down. And I think that intersection of storytelling and music and rhythm and meters sort of all coming together creates this very interesting, like, intersection where, like, we see basically, like, so much repetition around culture. Like, so many cultures have storytelling musical devices in order to, like, relay information in that way, as I was saying. And so, yeah, I'm hoping that, especially in trying to understand a lot more ancient poetry and some of the nuances we can glean in some of the more contemporary stuff, we can actually look more deeply at music and stories and see how they shape human existence in a particular way, which I think as students of the humanities would be very, very interesting and helpful for us at a time where it seems like humanities are being devalued or other such stuff. We can be like, actually, no, here are the ways historically over thousands of years that, like, these different types of things that seem to not have as much in these time periods capitalistic worth that you can nail down. We can still make the argument for why they're important, which I think is crucial at this time.
Kind of following on from that innateness, and Jermaine, what you mentioned about, like, obviously the importance of developing technology, do you think that in our kind of intrinsic rhythmic kind of inclination that we're going to hit a peak of how much we've developed that skill, or is it something that we're constantly improving at over, like, generations and over different, like, art forms, and, as you said, like, different forms of poetry that have kind of sprung up in different points in the human history?
I'm not sure that it's going to move from worse to better. I think that they change as tastes change. I think that, sometimes we have seen the development of these rhythms and rhyme schemes in hip hop become more complex as people realize they can do more and more with their language. But then at the same time, sometimes flows come into fashion, they move out of fashion. No one, maybe Eminem, raps like super fast anymore. I think people kind of got over that and realized that, okay, there are other things that we can do that that might speak it in different ways. Do I think that we might go back to rapping really quickly? Like, possibly. And I think that there are people who, and I think that there is the possibility for new interventions to come in that we couldn't possibly think of right now. But I think that doesn't necessarily mean that the old ones were simple and, you know, are archaic in some way. I think that they're sort of different, just sort of different. And I think that art just sort of has these cycles sometimes.
To jump in again, I think it's also important to note that like hip hop came up in the middle of like a very fascinating musical, I mean, what I might call a musical revolution of the 20th century. Like if you look at how many just genres of music cropped up out of America in that like entire century, it's wild. And then it's like you have hip hop sort of at like the tail end of it. But it's like, you know, without, you know, understanding like the history of Motown, the history of like all these different forms of like jazz, rhythm and blues, soul, like all these different types of music, new music that were popping up all of a sudden and interacting, but also the development of like music labels and companies and copywriting that, and how much early hip hop struggled too, because it's like, well, you're playing remixes of beats and copyrighted music, so like who are we crediting? Like how do we form systems around this? And I think that there's some fascinating parallels too when you look at antiquity, especially like borrowing of meters and other sorts of things, and the development of different types of music that gets performed on different types of stages too. So I think there is also like, you have to look at it embedded too within its own musical context, because like trying to just start in the 80s or late 70s and 80s with like hip hop in the Bronx, it's just like, oh no, but wait, we have to look at everything that was happening coming right before that as well. So.
Right, and to respond to that again, yes, hip hop is not this obvious that just sprung out of nothing. As Vanessa was saying, it's extremely, not only is it influenced by these earlier genres in this cultural revolution, it's very much it's very much aware of its own generic history and will give nods to it and pay homage to its predecessors in interesting ways. And the producers who are making the beats oftentimes will have things to say in their composition of music by mixing certain songs and doing it and using certain tactics that essentially honor their predecessors and might gesture at the generic history.
Thank you guys, that was really interesting, especially that kind of discussion of how different genres of art are informed by each other, and like you said, Jermaine, at the end there, the generic history. I think that's a really interesting point to remember from that question. A question now for Vanessa more specifically, but obviously Jermaine, if you have any thoughts on this, we'd love for you to jump in as well. So why do you think that Sappho has become so popular among younger classicists and young people? Do you think this is because of how she's almost become a symbol, or more because of the content or musicality of her work? What kind of role do you think each of those things plays?
So of course, like the easy cop-out answer is just like, when has a subversive woman never not been inspirational to the youth? Like, you know, they tend to fill that role. No, but I mean, I say that though very seriously, even for myself. I first encountered Sappho when I was 12, and I was reading the Odyssey for the first time in class, and we had to do this very interesting event called Night of the Notables, where we just dress up as someone from history. And I liked the Odyssey a lot, but I also thought it was kind of boring at times, that it dragged, which is like an opinion that I actually deeply respect now. I wish I could keep up that energy. But I was interested to see if there were any just like female Homers was basically, I was just like, oh, is there a girl like this from ancient Greece? And my like social studies teacher at the time was like, I guess Sappho, but and that was like interesting for me to like check out Sappho from the library, and it was like this very, very thin little book of fragments, and like not even all of them. And like that compared to like the Odyssey and like the Iliad, I was just like, oh, well, like why do we have so little? But reading that very little, I was then just like, wait, I'm very taken with this very little. How is this so poetic? But then I think also it reminded me so much of like contemporary poetry that I'd read that was more fragmented, short, like it felt very current and like relatable and like fresh. And like, you know, I was in middle school, so I was a big lover of Francesca Lia Bloch, who's a big West Coast writer, for those who know. And she does very similar styles. So I was like, oh, this very romantic, very like, you know, female centric, but also like community oriented stuff. Like, absolutely, I'm into this. Flowers, love it. And it wasn't until like much later that I even realized that she's this like large queer icon. And I was like, oh, okay, wow, also cool, I guess. But I think she's popular because also she's just such a controversial figure in the canon specifically, in that she just sort of disproves many things that I think like classicists try to make sort of like assumptions about the canon. Like she has like, we have so much of her work because she's talked about in so many interesting ways. She also has a lot of very interesting reception in antiquity itself, and like just the amount that people would talk about her or go back and forth, whether or not there was a prostitute that was her or that was a separate person. And I think also just in that sort of in antiquity, there's a strangeness to her dialect too that people like remark on. It's why we have so many of her fragments as well. It's because it's just grammarians being like, okay, so like this is the way you're supposed to write these different phrases, except, okay, Sappho and like some of the other like lesbian liar tribe, they were all just like wilding out, like adding extra megas to things for no reason. And I'm just like fascinated. I love this. Tell me more. Why are they speaking weird? And like, even just like the way folks talk about her in antiquity, they're just like, well, she wasn't very attractive. She was just kind of like small and dark and like kind of like measly in there. And I'm just like, I love this. Like, you know, like, who is she? So I think there is that genuine curiosity that she invokes beyond her being, I think, like this one of the most famous queer icons in history. And even in her queerness, I think there's like an intense familiarity there that I really love. Like, even though it's like a Black woman who I'm just like, you know, Sappho, this like Greek island lady, who was she? Who, like, how can I really know and understand her? But I feel connected to her in how much women are oriented in her poetry, how there is such an intense preference for women, but also just female company in general, but also just like calling people together in this like very communal way. She definitely has her own brand of celebrity in antiquity, that I would say. But also, I think that there's such an interesting and almost refreshing voice that she brings to the canon. And studying her is fascinating as well. Like, I didn't realize as I was getting into more of the study of the lyre in ancient Greece that I was actually like attempting to learn this very, very long history of musical appropriation, or at least I guess that's the closest terminology that I can think of to describe it, because from like the 8th century filtering down to like the 5th and 4th, like especially in Athens, there's just this like wild like mix and like reorienting of music. You see the music centers like popping out and around all over like the Aegean, like they stop in Sardis, like it's in Delphi for a bit, it's in Delos, it's in Lesbos, like all of these different places that, like, interestingly enough, all the like Greek prose novels later get set in all these places. So I'm like, what's that like connection, like music centers and Greek prose? Someone should write a paper on it. But we see these things of like different types of rhythm popping up out of different islands, coming from like the mainland, of people saying like these meters belong to these people or like those ones. And then like all of this eventually trickles down into like the very fascinating form that is like Athenian drama of the 5th century. And sort of later like comedy too. And I'm not as good with comedy, so I'm still trying to figure out how all these things relate, especially since music and comedy is such a different bag than with tragedy. But I think Sappho in particular, and I've just been getting a lot more into like tragedies choral lyric. I have a feeling also she has a lot more impact, especially on like a lot of the terminology that gets used around monodies too. So I think there is a almost intertextual, but I feel weird using intertextual. There needs to be a musical version for it in antiquity. I want to be able to talk about this more. There is an interesting musical influence that I've started to notice more because I've been researching her more in her forms, that I think that's like also present. And like, you know, she's weirdly accessible, like a lot so than a lot of other authors that we read. It's kind of easy to jump into fragments for that reason and jump out. But even her one complete long poem, I'm just always like, oh, same. Like you're lying in bed full of longing. Like who has not been there? Like we all have. This is a very like, there are few things about classics I would say are like universal, and weirdly, Sappho might be one of the few that I would actually say that.
That is a really interesting thing that you just said there. Everything there really, especially I think because it's so fragmentary, I think I've found it quite easy to almost see Sappho as quite separate from a lot of the other sort of like poetic forms in Greece. But considering like her influence on the different forms as they developed in different parts of Greece and different islands, that is actually that's really thought-provoking actually. In my head, I've kind of like, I guess it's almost like a dream that Sappho is this woman that's almost like Megan Thee Stallion, who has this like group of women around her all the time, and she has that like sense of community, and as well as like centering the feminine experience and feminine sexuality and eroticism to some extent, that like it is, as you say, like timeless in that sense.
Yeah, I think Megan is an interesting parallel. Actually, especially because I just watched, like, she did an interview with Maxine Waters, actually, of just about talking about Black womanhood, especially given 2020 and like everything that happened. Oh, for those who might not know, Megan Thee Stallion, who's one of my favorite newer rappers, she got shot in her feet back in 2020 in the midst of a lot happening by another rapper named Tory Lanez. And it was very stressful, especially with like a lot of people just kind of turning on her, calling her a liar for it, until she just sort of came out, was like, actually no, like I was trying to protect, like, you know, my ex-friend and like colleague because of what was happening in the middle of 2020 last year. But she was like, you know, like I didn't come here to deal with all this crap. So she's been very outspoken, especially around trying to protect Black women more, and especially looking at safety and being more outspoken about these things. So she had this interview, and Maxine said, she was just like, so I listened to WAP, and like Megan was like, oh god, like, oh no, I'm so embarrassed. Maxine was like, no, like this is good, like I promise you. She's like, because I remember like the 90s and like coming up with like so many of the rap forms that were there, and it's like the men could say what they want, but that was still a time where it's like, you know, women couldn't, like, you know, there was Little Kim, but like that was kind of it. And she was just like, so like when I saw you and Cardi like singing the song, you know, I just thought like, that's audacity, like that is like, you know, exactly what, you know, women should be able to do with hip hop. I think that's also true of Sappho, especially in the context of so much of antiquity. Like, I mean, it's not a hot take to say like antiquity is pretty misogynistic, like especially most of the writers that we have from antiquity. I mean it in like the very literal sense of just like the way that they talk about women as inferior. They just don't like women very much, and it's like, that's real. And there are obviously different exceptions, different sort of pushbacks against this, but I think Sappho is just such an interesting, like encompassing an alternate view who is very audacious. Like, you know, she still talks down like at other women, especially, you know, like the ones who are sleeping with her brothers, or like, you know, once she feels are her rivals like Andromeda. But like, so there's still so much of that like intense, like embedded in the culture that she's a part of, but it's also, she's saying something very different, and I would say audacious as well. So thank you for the Megan Thee Stallion parallel.
Thank you for engaging with it too, and I hope that maybe the idea that you can compare the two is one that our audience will enjoy as well. A question now for Jermaine, to shift our conversation into a new direction, do you think that we can compare the cultural revolution of Roman love elegy to the rise of hip hop in the way that both these movements sort of challenge societal expectations and also face different degrees of opposition? And how do you think that race also complicates this comparison, especially like race and the different concepts of it in antiquity and obviously in the modern day?
Right, so I'm actually going to start with the race complication. So when I was preparing for this conversation, I was looking back through Propertius actually, and not Ovid. Propertius is generally where I like to hang out when it comes to Latin love poetry, and he's my personal favorite Latin author. And in the last poem of his first book, which is published and released as a collection before the rest of them, he starts this poem with like the line "Qualis et unde genus." Genus, a lot of people translate as race. Obviously, the ancients did not have a conception of race the same way that we did, the same way that we do now, and it might refer more to it refers more to his family and his birth and the place where he was born. But I was reading this poem again, and I found it very interesting and profound, the same way that I found it interesting and profound the first time that I read it. And I mocked up a little translation. It's very short, but it's a very short poem, but it really, really spoke to me. So he is talking to this person, Tullus, who might or might not be his patron, possibly a fictional character. But he says, "You always ask, on account of our friendship, Tullus, what sort of people and from where, and what sort of household gods are mine? If the Perusine tombs are known to you, the graveyards of Italy's hard times, when Roman discord led her own citizens, kind of like in a triumph, or maybe in the sense of, ruled over. When Roman discord led her own citizens, let the Etruscan dust especially be a sorrow for me. You let the limbs of my kinsmen be scattered. You covered their wretched bones with not a scrap of soil. Near there, Umbria, touching the field below, birthed me from its rich, fertile lands." So he does not have a minority racial identity in the same way that the American political context would conceive of it. But what he does have is he does have an identity of birth that is fundamentally linked to his poetic project on account of a certain political situatedness, which I think is extremely important and extremely relevant. And I believe that all of the elegists have this to a certain degree, even if it's not as pronounced as Propertius's is at that precise moment. And
I replied to him.
And I think that a similar thing happens with
You
hip
when we were watching. Okay, well, I'm
Sorry,
Troy,
watching
your mic is on.
because there's.
Yeah, if we could just make sure that everyone in the audience could turn their microphones off, that would be perfect. Thank you.
Right. So what was I talking about? Political situatedness and hip hop. Yes. Okay. So just a background for those of you who do not know about the background of Roman love elegy. it we forgive you, Joy. And it happens at a time following a long period of Roman civil war. There have been lists of prescriptions, and prescriptions are basically when a person in power makes a list of people whom it is legal to kill, and if you kill them, you can claim their property. So there's a high incentive to kill these people as well. Even though we don't necessarily see war now in the same way, right? Wars tend to be fought far away. I do think that the prescriptions would have been a very visibly bloody and traumatic time for the Roman people, where you would see your neighbors getting drawn out into the streets and slaughtered. Propertius is from a place where is from near a city, Perugia, which he mentions in this poem, where there was a war between the citizens of Italy and Augustus's own army, where these people are backed up into the city and they are besieged in this town, and it gets very dire. And eventually they have to give up because they're going to starve to death. And Augustus, well, now Octavian, the would-be Augustus, the will-be Augustus, he after he takes the city, he takes out 300 of the town's leading noblemen and slaughters them in the middle there. This is the context that Propertius grows up in. And then when Augustus comes to consolidate power, what he is doing is he imposes moral legislation which requires Roman men, citizen men, to get married and attempt to produce 3 children. And if they cannot do that, then they do not receive their full citizen rights. And so in making love poetry, the genre and form itself is one that is fundamentally opposed to this legislation, because if you are running around chasing after your beloved, who, according to many, is not even a citizen and is a courtesan, a sex worker, you are not settling down and having children the way that the leader wants you to. And also there seems to be some sort of like softer program going on where Augustus is trying to encourage art and poetry that is good for the regime. And so also, if you are a poet who is publishing, who is not doing the sorts of work that he wants you to do, this also in itself is sending a very powerful statement. To move back to the American context, in the 80s, there were a lot of problems with the influx of drugs into primarily like Black urban communities, but they were affecting more people than the Black community. But Ronald Reagan puts into play legislation that increases police powers and mandatory minimums and things like that is massively increasing the incarcerated population of Black citizens. And the hip hop artists are talking about this, right? This is the sort of setting for their work. Some of them actually were drug dealers. Some of them continue to be drug dealers. Some of them, many of them are not. And the situations that they portray are fictional, but they are set in the scene, and these disturbing scenes that they often portray are reflective of this environment. And it is done some have argued, like Chuck D of Public Enemy says that hip hop is the Black CNN. It's a sociological lens. It is a means of seeing the world in this countercultural politically resistant sort of way. And what happens is it becomes increasingly self-referential, as we were talking about before, and it starts to bump up against power in the way that you see when Ovid starts pushing these generic tropes to their very limit. And some of the tactics that they use, we can talk about them in the Q&A, are so remarkably similar. And it is just this, it's really incredible to put them side by side. The piece that Treya had kindly mentioned earlier talks about it and put some of them side by side if you want to see, or we can talk about them more in the Q&A. And I think that there's a lot to gain by doing this, even if we, acknowledge, okay, the limitations of the racial discourse are there, but I don't think that they're so necessarily hindering that they will necessarily debone discourse of a sort of people that feels politically oppressed, trying to essentially be heard through music that's going to be consumed both by people who feel the same way that they do, but also possibly by other people.
Ooh, if I can actually follow up with another point on that. Yeah, especially I think there's always like the question around like race and antiquity, which to me, I'm just like, I don't know, so much of the anxiety around discussing race and antiquity is white people feeling anxious about race. So I'm just like, well, if you guys could get your anxiety out of it, there's actually so many parallels that you can draw. Number one being bonded labor. Let's actually look at some parallels when it comes to composition. I am very moved and persuaded by Columbia professor Joseph Howley's research on the Roman book and role slavery had to play with it, especially looking at the role of production of text, of composition, of what the authors themselves have said about just like the role slaves have played in the production of literature and music in different ways too. And I think where I find this very compelling in thinking through sort of comparative forms of poetry from antiquity to the contemporary is the very fascinating preoccupation in America, especially with individualism and genius versus collective and genius. And I think hip hop in particular, and lots of different forms of Black music and art really lean into the ideas of collective and of multiple people being contributing to a work. But I think also, and I mean, we do get this from Papa Britain initially, so like, it's not all America. I do think there is a big preoccupation with the idea of like, oh, the genius who just like shelters himself away and like does things. But it's like, even so many geniuses from like American and British history, like they had families, they had like all of this other labor that was around them that people are finally starting to acknowledge now. Like, look at George Lucas's first Star Wars trilogy versus the second when he lost his wife as editor. Like, there are very interesting parallels you can draw. But like, I know, like, especially growing up, I think it was with music, and it was often a long racial divides that like I heard about this sort of like differentiation of just like, oh, well, so-and-so deserves to win the Grammy over so-and-so because like they produced all of the music, they wrote it all themselves, like they did it all themselves versus like all of these contributors to one. And then I think within hip hop itself, there's like that argument that gets made too, especially with rappers, whether or not you write your own raps, that's a very contentious thing. That is a lot of the heart of Nicki Minaj and Cardi B beefing, because Cardi does not write her own raps and Nicki is just like, I have a lot of issues with that. And so I think that looking at some of these like parallels, especially around individualism versus like collective or more like community, or even like forced bonded labor to create production. I think there's a lot of very interesting parallels to draw, but like especially like the history with Black art and bondage in this country makes it one of the best lenses to look at bondage and art in antiquity. So yeah.
Thank you, Vanessa. As Danielle Padilla Peralta has just said, thank you for speaking that truth. It's a brilliant addition to obviously any sort of discussion of race in antiquity, is that acknowledgement of sort of white anxiety that kind of pervades the field whenever it's even slightly breached. Kind of following up from both of those strands of discussion, I suppose for both of you a question: do you think that instead of seeing this sort of like race element of comparison as a debilitating one, there's an extent to which actually just existing as a Black musician is something that, especially in the 80s, like made rappers and hip hop artists like countercultural before even they got like the chance to say anything on the mic? Is that something that you think maybe compares to the way some love elegists' identities like played such an important part in their message and the way that they were received as well?
Yes, absolutely. I'm not sure I have further comment on that. I don't think I'm going to qualify it. But yes, my answer to that is yes.
To pull a little further back to add another genre into this, I would say you also see an interesting, not to bring a whole author we haven't even talked about till now onto the stage, Euripides. What a fascinating dude when it comes to his impact on music, especially his like relationship with Alos players and composers, and a lot of his just like trying to give credence and like support towards like what was being called new music in Athens. Like at this time there was like this very intense like revolution of music that Plato and Aristotle intensely critiqued, and I think that there is some very fascinating parallels with that, especially with like the rise of hip hop. Like I don't know, there's just like a way that Plato talks about new music, especially in the laws, that like just reminds me so much of like the early to mid aughts like conservatives being like, oh no, hip hop is causing like all of these things and it's terrible, and I'm just like, yeah, I don't care. And thank you to Pauline Levin at Yale for writing the book The Many-Headed Muse, which basically she's just like, yeah, new music's great, like what's up with these conservative like philosophy boys who just like don't have rhythm and beat. I'm very paraphrasing, that's not a direct quote, but kind of, that's kind of the introduction.
Yeah, to add on that, I mean, the way that hip hop has become essentially like globally coded in this way, you see that the genre itself has sort of become a shorthand for at the very least street culture, if not a lot more, and especially as you start to see hip hop traditions sort of develop in places outside of America. You know, you see you see the reaction to a lot of grime in the UK and in China. You know, how it at one point hip hop had been banned from the airwaves, regardless of content. Really, just it was hip hop as a shorthand just for everything associated with it. And I think that that's a very interesting parallel with the new music and Plato.
Also, another thing that I know, at least like thinking through like hip hop and like rap and like just like how much they're embedded and like related to culture has really helped shed some light, like especially when I go back to like a choral lyric and Latin elegy, especially, of just like how embedded in culture these things are. So like when you're talking about, you know, like there's such an association with like street music and hip hop globally now, it's like, oh yeah, and like the rise of like streetwear and street fashion like in like the 90s and like thousands, and like what that looked like, and just like the impact it had like on all of these different types of like like art forms, but also then like textiles and other things, and just all these different forms of self-fashioning and identity that like really went into it. And so like that's really helped me like my own like work. Like I'm looking at all these like makeup and hair and like fashion and cosmetics in like all of this choral lyrics. So I'm like, right, this is like all they're singing about. Like in Sappho, she's just like, all right, here's the type of shoes you need from Sardis. Like here are like the acceptable ways to bind your hair with flowers depending on hair color. Here's the, I'm just like, oh my gosh, like there's so much happening. Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say, what you said, I was saving this, but it relates to a question that I think we should probably address right now. From Bos Van de Ven. I do not know if I butchered your name. I am sorry if I did. But it basically says, from my understanding, hip hop is both a musical genre as well as a way of life. Do you think that the parallels end at the musical genre, or is there a way of life relevance parallel to, I mean, what we're talking about as well? And yes, I think that first off, yes, hip hop is, I would actually distinguish hip hop from the music itself. I would say that hip hop is the culture, and then rapping is the medium. And hip hop culture is Black street culture, and that includes mixing. It includes street fashion, as Vanessa was talking about. It includes street art, and graffiti culture, and breakdance, and all these other things are all. I would say that these all fall under the umbrella of hip hop. There for Elegy, this is a very interesting question. Jasper Griffin, R.I.P. formerly of Oxford, has a book called like The Latin Poets in Roman Life, I believe, and he thinks that essentially like the elegists are modeling like the Mark Antony lifestyle, which is a take that I reject altogether. But I mean, it's very interesting to think about these things in conjunction with one another. Do I think that the genre is more powerful if it corresponds to an actual lifestyle that some people are living out in Rome to some degree? I think so. Do I think that we should necessarily equate the poets to this lifestyle? I'm not sure. I mean, Catullus would say no. Would say no. Catullus 16, very famous poem, very interesting opening that high schoolers always repeat when they find out about it, that I'm not going to repeat right now. But and so, I mean, do I think there are some people who are living like this in Rome to some degree in order to be countercultural? I think that's entirely possible. Do I think that we should necessarily project this lifestyle on the artists? I would say no, but I would also say that about hip hop, in that if we're extending hip hop culture to like the drug culture that they're talking about, I don't think that all rappers are dealing drugs all the time, right? And so I don't know if that entirely answers your question.
I actually have I can jump off with more answer too. I think that I strongly agree. I think hip hop is a lifestyle. I might even say philosophy. Goes so far as a fancy type lifestyle, but I mean, obviously, different ideas of fanciness. I think also lifestyle is such like an interesting choice of words too, and how that like, and especially how embedded it is with like identity, and especially like minority identities too. because it's like, yeah, like thinking about different like types of ancient poetry, I'm just like, oh yeah, like whether or not they lived like, you know, that lifestyle. Now I was like, wait, but Sappho, like, you know, she literally created like her entire brand of lifestyle that people like based off. I'm just like, you know, the queer lifestyle of like Sappho and like what that looks like. And that's so much of her reception too. So I definitely think there are some like interesting parallels looking back at antiquity. And this is again where I'm like, oh, Sappho being relevant to everything. Love her for it. But yeah, I think especially with like Elegy, that's such like an interesting parallel, especially considering the like how forced like the family unit was during that time period. But at the same time, I think there's like fascinating parallels again with like the late 20th century in America, and like just especially it's like, you know, right as America's ramping up our like globalization and like weird imperial stuff like in like Asian things, and like people are dying, like Nam has happened, like all of these different sort of like the civil rights movement, like the 60s were so much. But oh, I also, right, as you were talking, I want to mention, just in case folks didn't know, in case they were like, how do I just learn about this? Like in like a quick and perhaps very overly aesthetic way. Netflix has a show called The Get Down by Baz Luhrmann. I have some issues with it. And it is like a Baz Luhrmann production. So that is definitely something folks should know. It's a very Moulin Rouge-y type version of the beginnings of hip hop. But I think it, at least for folks who are like interested in understanding, especially like a lot of the cultural moment that was happening, he does kind of like hit the nail on the head of like making sure to like talk about what was really going on like in and around the Bronx, the politics, the different forms of art and culture that were coming together, the different levels of identity with like the differences in religion even that were like happening in those areas. Like I think it's also very important, which is like a whole other level around like religious music that we have not had the time to even get into, and I doubt that we will, but that's a whole other conversation to have too.
Yeah, I notice we are falling under the constraints of time, but I think that in that kind of conversation of culture, music, and lifestyle, I wonder if there is, like, just quickly to touch on this, I wonder if there is like a comparison with any form of ancient poetry where like hip hop culture, broadly speaking, has kind of been stripped of some of its like Black identity in the way that it's been reproduced in K-pop to some extent, where there are like Black women writing some of the songs and styling artists, but there's like not often that much credit, especially in like the last few decades, not that much credit of like the origins of like obviously the socio-political context in which like these like the style emerged and the culture emerged from. I wonder if there's another like if there's a comparison of that kind of divorce between the origin and the like end product of that art form.
Just really quickly, and that's I think exactly what's compelled me a lot about Joseph Howley's research and sort of like trying to place where labor and production sort of like happens and resides. But also I think there's some very fascinating from like the area I've been looking at parallels, especially with the East, the Near East, and sort of like the developing changes around that, and sort of like the ways in which like the East gets portrayed in different ways, and especially on the stage, and especially when talking about the Trojan War and sort of like these past events that are like suddenly like building this sense of national identity because there's like this previous, the Persian Wars have like just happened like 50 years prior to like the height of Greek drama. However, to take things out of Greece and Italy really quick, another scholar, Solange Ashby, has been doing fascinating work looking at the role of Nubia in a lot of religious practices around Hathor in Egypt. And I think there is actually an interesting parallel there to jump down into North Africa, looking at the sort of transference of like Nubian iconography that Egypt sort of started to absorb and repurpose for different reasons, specifically around the goddess Hathor and Isis too. But I need to keep reading more of her research. So that's a weird, interesting Africa parallel for folks.
The last question and a half, I suppose, from me before we go on to our Q&A session, which there's so many questions in the chat that I can't wait for us to get into. Firstly, for both of you, what's it like? What has it been like to do this kind of sort of untraditional research in any form, and how has the reception been to this, and what kind of response have you received?
So I actually don't conceive of myself as like the most non-traditional scholar in the world. I mean, I am trying to break out more and more of my training and open myself up to a lot of new approaches and incorporating your material. But I think that more that when I was first learning about Elegy, I felt like I was being beaten over the head with I felt these parallels in my head were just absolutely just ringing and going off, and I just started writing them down. I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to talk about these. I'm gonna have to talk about these like at some point and write them down and try and get them published. But I suppose that I would sort of take the line of Richard Thomas at Harvard, where he has a lot of work on Bob Dylan, and how we think of like what a classic is, and thinking about musicians as the creators of literary classics, which I fully subscribe to. And when you conceive of it this way, it doesn't seem so crazy, non-traditional, or so odd. And yeah, I think that when you hear someone talking about Greek tragedy, they're automatically going to go to Shakespeare, like every time, as the point of comparison of, oh, this is what we think a tragedy looks like. It looks like this sort of tragedy in this way. It doesn't look like this sort of tragedy in this way. These comparisons are already happening consciously and unconsciously. And quite frankly, this is related to the way that we perceive of a canon of literary classics that has been largely informed by this Western narrative of what the great authors are, and you can compare them to each other. But when you compare them to lower artists, these comparisons suddenly become inappropriate, which I think we should push back on. As for the reception, I haven't gotten any super negative reception so far. I've gotten a fair bit of positive reception. I think these things are largely self-selecting, where people who are interested in these things will ask about, oh, is anyone doing anything on classics and hip hop, and then someone will send them a link to an article or something like that. I do believe that if I were to move the primary focus of my research from like Latin literature and Roman social history to this sort of comparative work, like more intensely, I would have a much more negative reception, or if not an overtly negative reception. It would be like, okay, well, that's all well and good, but what's your real research so we can hire you? And that's a real problem. I was talking to a fairly prominent older Black classicist about this, and she said, what often ends up happening is you have to pay your dues doing the sort of traditional work in order to get to the payoff of being able to do the work that you really want to do, or the work that sort of speaks to your identity in the sort of way, and it's a problem. I mean, I really do like my more traditional sort of work, but I do think that these channels, even though people are publishing, are largely closed for people who want to focus on this sort of thing, and it's something that needs to change. especially as we consider how the field should be changing.
Yeah, I'm just like, I agree with so much of what you said. But from the other side of things, I am a very non-traditional scholar, and I've always considered myself such, but like since like high school. And I went to, like, for context, the Evergreen State College is a very non-traditional college. We don't have grades, but if you screw off, you lose credit and get it axed from you. So that's losing money and very scary and terrifying in and of itself. But also we're an interdisciplinary school, so I always learned like multiple subjects at once and like was expected to do it in that way. So then jumping into a master's program at an Ivy League where they're just like one thing, and I'm like, I have a question about how these other things relate. And they were just like, we have never heard a question like that before. And I'm like, this is sad. But I tried to do things traditionally. I found a PhD program I liked. Professors kept asking me to apply. Like, I went, I did my visit, and then, 2 days before New York shut down for like COVID, they were just like, oh, we don't want you. So I was like, oh, well, okay, I guess I should just go back to doing things the way that like I've always been used to and comfortable with doing them, because like, I have like my own life. Like, I'm a kid of the digital age. I know how to talk to people online. So like, if I can't do this traditionally through an institution, then like I might as well try to do things non-traditionally. And, doing things the traditional way, no one was really interested in anything I had to say or what I was doing. And I didn't receive like the greatest support around it. So why don't I just keep doing the things that I think are worth doing in the field? Because like, there is so much work to do in this field. There are so many connections to make. There are so many ways in which like we could just like, I don't know, get people talking with each other. But for some reason in classical studies, folks just are really bad at talking to each other. And so I found that like ever since I stopped trying to do things traditionally, folks have been really into it. But I mean, partly like, I think the question is also like trying to understand like who is your own audience, which I think is really important. And for me, I've been trying to like especially reach more Black folks. I'm trying to think of ways to do that. Folks who are already in the field, folks who might just be outside but are in like related fields, folks who are in disparate fields. But I'm like, actually, I think like some of your work could relate to mine. Because like that's just sort of like who I want to be in more community with, and like there's not that many Black people in the field of classical studies, though there have been more. And being on the internet, able to do that, I've been able to find that audience much better and been able to reach people that like I hadn't been able to reach at a cold marble Ivy League before. And so that's been like really great. And yeah, I'd say.
Thank you guys for sharing such personal stuff with us. If we like now move to sort of the Q&A part of tonight's discussion, I think that would be perfect. So we can squeeze in as many of the questions as possible. Firstly, Kay Francis Brody, would you like to ask your question yourself, or I can read it out? Feel free to turn your camera on.
You can ask it for me. I typed it in earlier. I've known Jermaine for a long time, and I'm really curious. Like, I think there's an interesting link between the concept of hubris and Greek drama and what's wound up happening to some of the more avant-garde or kind of gangster rappers in earlier time, like Tupac and Notorious B.I.G. And obviously they were speaking from where they came from, and they wound up, are they Greek heroes or are they Greek poets? Like, I feel like there's like a really interesting dichotomy between those two things. And I'm wondering if any of you have thought of that, or maybe that's an inappropriate question. And if it is, I'm sorry. So I'm gonna hang up now.
I mean, I think that to a certain degree they've been mythologized. Biggie and Tupac especially. I certainly think that, you know, the gang violence of the 90s was a huge problem for the culture and the way that it had to redefine itself, right? I remember seeing an interview with Diddy about Biggie's death and how after he died, he was stuck with all these recordings of Biggie that he wasn't sure how he was going to be able to move because of the nature of his death and how this was, being reported in the media. And, people didn't want to become associated with it. And the way that he fixed it was that he started layering, sort of going back to what Vanessa was saying, he started layering tracks that older Black people specifically would respond to, right? Like taking the Diana Ross "I'm Coming Out" and putting it under Biggie for "More Money, More Problems." And then I think that the situation of the 90s and what's going on with the gangs and hip hop culture and all that is just so incredibly complicated and hard to untangle. But I mean, if you noticed, I mean, for the most part, this violence has really slowed down. I mean, there hasn't been when was the last time a rapper got killed? Was it X? Does anyone remember? Or was it Nipsey? Although I'm not sure Nipsey was affiliated. But I mean, the amount of actual violence in the community has declined tremendously. And I think that they get mythologized and they get turned into these sort of larger than life figures who do these larger than life things, good and bad, in the sort of Greek heroic sense. I don't think that being a poet and being a hero are necessarily exclusive. I mean, the Greek poet Archilochus was considered both, although he was considered a hero in a different sense. I mean, I guess I'm going to stop there. I don't know if Vanessa has anything.
I actually do. I have so many thoughts. They're specters. But heroes can become specters, but so can poets. I think, yeah, these figures are specters. To keep with the ancient parallel, I've been really into Derrida's concept of hauntology recently, but specifically how it gets applied to music, and especially like Black music. There's a fascinating article about hauntology and Afrofuturism in music for folks who are interested. I'm pretty sure it's online for free. I should look it up, my bad. But I think there's this very interesting, especially with music and like, this concept of the voice. I think there's this interesting way in which these figures sort of haunt through like the past and each other. I found hauntology, especially like trying to think through like the ways in which like musical beats and rhythms in antiquity is like a really good lens of just like, okay, so like Sappho is clearly haunting some of these love elegy poets. Like in what way? Like how is she manifesting through meter, through subject matter, through like all these different things? And I think there's a very like heavy parallel with that. Like with rappers, but also like I was thinking like R&B stars, Aaliyah, like, oh my gosh, the impact Aaliyah still has even after she died in 2001. It's like 20 years later, she was trending like the other day, and I was just like, oh, Aaliyah again, like what, still haunting us. And I find haunting just to be a very useful metaphor. Thank you, Danielle Peralta, who's here, who gave me that last year when I went to your talk on the Haunted House of Classics. It set me on a hauntology spin, and I'm very grateful for it.
Continuing with our gratefulness to Professor Dan Padilla as a contribution to our field, would you like to read out your question, or else I can read it for you?
Sure, I can read it before I'm whisked off by screaming ones. So one of the thoughts that occurred to me, especially when engaging with Jermaine and Vanessa's works in other contexts, is that whenever we see these uproars and backlashes, the top 50 lists of hip hop artists, something that occurs often in the Twitter sphere these days, we are seeing an effort to sort of investigate and interrogate canonicity, hypercanonicity, classicism, like in the very lived moment. of hip hop's reinvention as a genre for a 21st century market. So I thought I would open that up for you both as you both engage in work that very much attempts to qualify and interrogate the edges of canonicity, and see where you both took it.
I mean, we've talked about this in person before about who's the greatest. What does it mean to be the greatest? Is Joe Budden really the number 3 best rapper of all time?
Here, here.
No, he's not. But I mean, yeah, I think it's very interesting. I think it's related. I think that this is honestly related to the sort of Fauna commented during, I believe, my response to Kay's question, that like braggadocio is a big part of hip hop culture, and how this is related to sort of the fact that this is a male dominated space of largely these black men trying to prove their manliness by through poetry, which sounds kind of ridiculous when you think about how a lot of people conceive of poetry and what people conceive of as traditionally masculine endeavors. But I mean, I think that there's a couple of things. One, hip hop is a community, and so the community has to understand what you're saying, but you also have to be able to prove that you are the master of this tradition by referring to your predecessors in these really interesting and innovative ways. And in order to do that, you have to have a sort of they have to sort of create a body of what's actually worth listening to, and this can be good in the way that when you hear a really like subtle reference that no one's going to get, you feel proud of yourself when you pick up on something very slight, but then it also has the sort of nasty backlash of who essentially gets swept under the rug because they don't end up on these lists, and especially when you have a sort of culture like hip hop that thrives in the underground. What does it mean to essentially move all these people to the front and say like, oh well, these are the greats, and we're telling you what to enjoy, and I think that it actually has a tension with sort of like the philosophy of the genre itself, one that I've not yet reconciled, but I think that it certainly also has very interesting reflections in our own recent field discussions on canon and how we frame them, and so I mean, I think it's really interesting to see it play out in a different space that we're connecting in this way, especially considering like I would say sort of like the cultural association of the classics and the cultural association of hip hop sort of exists on exactly different opposite sides of the sort of like high art, low art spectrum. But yeah, I mean, Vanessa.
So I have a kind of clever answer using wordplay, which probably has holes in it because I just thought of it while Jermaine was talking. So feel free to definitely like tear it to pieces if it doesn't make sense. Yes, the canon question, one that I've been coming back to again and again, and I've actually been writing on a lot for the past 2 weeks. So yeah, canons. Oh no, my computer froze. Did I freeze? I hope I didn't freeze. Okay, no, I didn't.
You're still here.
Wait, good. It was like everyone like stopped for a second. I was like, no, please don't, right when I'm talking. This is terrible. Canon building, yes. Especially thinking about top 50 lists, because those have been really big on Twitter recently. I think that this is a point that I kept meaning to make earlier and I kept forgetting to. There's a very fascinating inherent structure, almost like kind of skeleton within hip hop, that I think is like part of it coming out of so many other different types of musical genres, but I think also just like a part that's like very embedded in a lot of forms of Black culture, particularly in America, that hip hop really kind of blows up in a very big and obvious way. There's a very interesting culture of citation that happens in the Black community, and being very specific around citation. I know most of this from like studying Black women in particular, who are very community oriented, have a very intense like process around citing each other. Citation practices in a lot of Black feminist critical theory is just like fascinating. I'm trying to get better at it, learn it more. And I think there's such like a fascinating parallel with hip hop as it emerged, and sort of those levels of referencing, not just vocally who you're calling out, but also in the music, how it's being reused, who you're choosing to add to your soundtrack, and how that's only grown over the years, like who's going to feature on your remixes, who's going to do like, you know, change your music in different ways. And I think that's a larger part of like this broader structure with a lot of Black culture in trying to sort of create these different art forms that keep popping up, especially out of America in these ways. That I have to question what is a canon, especially when we're talking about music, because yes, I understand canons of literature, but the first canon that I ever grew up with was Pachelbel's, because I played classical music, and that is a hellish canon for anyone who's played it, because I had to play the cello part because I'm harpist, and it's horrible. It's 8 notes repeated endlessly. But a canon is also a repetition. It's a type of music that is conformed in order to reference back to something and to become disparate, but then come together again in harmony. And so I think there is a very interesting rhythmic quality to the ways in which Black folks canonize in this country. And I would use that in the musical and in the sort of building canon sense. And I wonder about that repetition and its relationship to like the history of citation and the history of sort of Black reference, especially in this field, especially not in this field, in this country, especially with Black women. And so that's sort of like where a lot of my thoughts in trying to understand canons are. And that's also helped with sort of thinking not only about contemporary canon building with the Black community, but also really challenging my own conceptions of canons and how they've come from antiquity. Like, you know, especially considering our earliest texts, like would have been these oral traditions that were repeated and repeated and repeated until they were written down. That, you know, we have all these repetitive foots and meters at the end of things because, you know, we know this is about repetition. And so I think in trying to think through canons, I've had to really fall back on the first classical canon that I learned of, and really try to sort of stretch and embrace in a more musical way what canon building is and how it can form, especially in relationship to one another, if that makes sense.
Thank you guys. That was a really interesting discussion. Obviously, we are running quite low on time now. I'm hoping maybe we can squeeze in 3 more questions. Maybe that's quite ambitious, but
Lightning round,
there's
let's
just
go.
But okay. Steve O'Sullivan, if you'd like to go first, if you'd like to read out your question, or I can read it. Yeah. Actually, wait, Steve did mention that he'd left, so let me read that question. Okay, so question for Jermaine. The poetry of Catullus is much more that of a person with freedom to speak. The later Roman elegists are having to speak in reaction to the Augustan agenda and the doublethink needed to go along with that. How does that correspond to the double consciousness W.B. Du Bois talks about?
I mean, It's actually kind of one of my little pet peeves when classicists mention W.E.B. Du Bois. But I mean, sure. I mean, it has to. I mean, sure. It has to do with just the fact that, yeah, when you are living as an oppressed class, whether that's in a sort of, whether that's, you know, towards the bottom of a racial hierarchy in a society, or under a literal autocrat that slaughtered your family, you have to develop, you know, sort of alternate modes of communication, in order to sort of create a code of what you're saying, so that certain people can perceive it and certain people don't, you know, don't crack the code, essentially. I'm not sure that that's what's going on with the Elegists. It seems, I mean, when you see Propertius say that that, you know, his love for his beloved Cynthia is more important than, you know, producing an heir. And when he starts that poem by calling out Caesar, it's not exactly coded, it's just sort of resistant. Same thing with Ovid. I mean, clearly Augustus knew what he was saying because he got exiled. I guess I would also sort of push back on the idea that Catullus' time is necessarily that much more free than those working under the than those working under Augustus, especially because the Sullan proscriptions had happened in fairly recent cultural memory, where Sulla had, you know, offed a lot of his political enemies, and they could happen again. They did happen again. And, you know, when Catullus is, you know, sort of creating poets about Pompey and Caesar, who are the people who would be most likely to do that sort of thing again. I don't know if it's necessarily not as embedded in his mind that this is a thing that could possibly happen. I haven't quite worked this out yet. But I do like to push back on the sort of assumption that the Republic ends in 31, when you know, when Actium is over and it's like, oh, that's the end, or even a little after that. I think that I think that these sorts of freedom that are going away, and the sorts of like Republican, more democratic structures, if you could even call them that, really, have been eroding for a long time. I think that people probably had sensed that. So in this sense, I don't really know how to engage with this question. But I think I'll probably leave it at that.
Okay, not to rush too much, but for second question, Nicolette, if you'd like to ask with your camera on, or let me know if not.
Yeah, totally. And thanks everyone for this. I guess this relates more now to what Vanessa was saying about citation, but I was just really struck in your piece, Jermaine, about how you talked about, you know, genius.com and how it trains people not just to see webs of illusions, but to actually be members of communities of reading. And that really revolutionized how you yourself approached, you know, parsing and understanding Latin love elegy. So I was wondering, especially echoing calls like Ella Hazelworth's idea of a deep loves philology or queer philology, if like we can maybe reconcile this dichotomy between the traditional and more, you know, progressive aspects of the field, maybe with like a hip hop philology, or like if you see this going anywhere. And then obviously I thought Vanessa's piece on Sappho and Janelle Monáe was really kind of doing this, exemplifying maybe what this kind of reading could be, but I'm also not a philologist and not interested in defending philology as it is, so I'm happy to be told no. Anyway, thanks.
So actually, I'm gonna like answer this by also answering a question we didn't get to, our final question in our Q&A, which was on what is like the point of taking two such seemingly disparate fields, basically, of like hip hop and ancient poetry, and like comparing them, what can we glean? And I was like, I was talking to Jermaine a bit about that question, because I was like, it's hilarious. Like, I guess I just have always believed the inverse. I thought that literally I was so going through hell in high school with like dactylic hexameter in Latin class and like all this other stuff. I was just like, this is so complicated. But like most of the poetry I was reading them was like a lot of like 19th century romantic, like I had it like a Keats era and stuff. So I'm like, okay, cool, he's talking about like a Grecian urn, but this is not helping me. Like, I'm stressed. And it really wasn't until actually I had to start teaching dactylic hexameter when I was an undergrad. And I taught Latin for when I was an undergrad, 2 other undergrads. Looking back, I'm like, that was maybe a little sketchy. But that I finally like just started turning to rap, because I was like, oh wait, this is the only form of like English poetry that like actually plays around with different meters, with different stuff. Like still to this day, like my go-to is like Chance the Rapper's Run and Cocoa Butter Kisses, where I'm just like, all right, let's break it down. We have these meters here, we have a centoton here, we have like chiastic like metaphor structures here, we have like all this stuff, and it's perfect and it's great and very easy. I highly recommend everyone do it. But yeah, it's like, not to harp on Du Bois, but like, you know, going to grad school, it does feel like a lot of just like whack double consciousness, where you're just like, oh, I'm gonna have to wait how many years before I can write the things that I know are correct, and that like these parallels that I see, because like these professors who like haven't bothered listening to new music in 15 years have feelings about it. Like, that sounds like the opposite of what good research should be. Like, why are we kowtowing so much to like older conservative institutions and their like feelings about music? Oh right, we still read Plato's Laws for these reasons, and like have these thoughts about new music. It's a circular cyclical problem. But yeah, I just like, I guess like for philology, like as someone who like dances in and out of philology, I still am like, no, it is useful. There are ways to do it. This is one of the ways that I'm like, obvious. It seems so obvious. Why can't we just do it? But then I also realized that, you know, that part of the reason that like these conversations are only just now happening is like, yeah, I can't remember, like, you know, this is the first time I've been on a panel with another Black American, and like, you know, who grew up like in this country and understands like these contexts that I'm talking about. And so like that's part of the reason why I do a lot of my research, is I'm like, wait, but like these connections are so obvious and they could be made more. Like, I guess we just need the folks who actually have like, you know, the lived experience and like are actually interested in these matters to do so. Because like, you know, if tomorrow suddenly all of the, you know, classicists are like, so we need to like compare hip hop, you know, lyrics to like ancient lyrics, I'm like, cool, I really hope you guys are going to spend as much time with these hip hop lyrics as you do with ancient lyrics, because you really need to, and have an equal understanding of them in order to make these comparisons. And you need to take it seriously and find worth in it for itself, not just because it can help you with Greek and Latin better. So I guess that's my answer.
I've honestly forgotten the question.
Thanks. No, yeah, I appreciate that, because I think a lot of times the direction of, you know, what is helpful for what is just completely wrong. And right now, that couldn't be more felt. So thanks so much.
Right. Actually, so relating to, yes, the like, to what extent are these comparisons helpful? I think this also goes to a point on reception that I have been trying to grapple with. And it's just that so much of what I think of when I think of, you know, modern classical reception as defined by the bounds of the classics community is what, quite frankly, white classicists see as a sort of panacea for the racial ills of the field, and being like, oh, well, well, these Syrians are performing Euripides, so our field doesn't need to change as long as like we look at them. And yeah, Vanessa was saying that when you are comparing these two things, you need to be very careful not to be extremely reductive about one of them. Usually, the one on the side of the culture that is receiving these texts. And I also am interested in this question as far as it concerns canons, and I mentioned that one of my little pet peeves is classicists bringing up Du Bois, and another one of my pet peeves is classicists bringing up Walcott out of context, and it feels like when you aren't paying enough attention to the other culture, it just feels it feels tokenizing and oftentimes is and is often enraging sometimes, as like, for example, with the piece that I had written, this was actually responding to a movie on Ovid as a sort of like hip hop artist, kind of, and it was clear that there was not enough attention being paid to hip hop culture and how it could interact with classical, with Roman culture and these genres in interesting ways, despite there being quite a few Black artists involved on the project. But I imagine that they did not have much like creative say at the center of the whole thing. And I think that we constantly need to interrogate this when we're doing this sort of work. And also, I think that this is a big part of why diversity in the field is important, because the people who care about these sorts of things are going to pay more attention to them. Of course, this requires us to give them the respect for doing this sort of work, and also the resources, and the capacity to do this sort of work as well. And so this is my big reception soapbox right now, and I suppose it relates to all of the questions that we've been talking about before.
Thank you guys for what has been like a brilliant discussion this evening. Obviously, we've just run over by about 5 minutes, so just drawing everything to a close. If any of the audience members want to support us further, Ray, our president, has put several links in the chat. Thank you all for coming, and we hope that you'll be supporting us again next term. And we look forward to hosting more brilliant speakers like both of you in the future, and hopefully we'll stay in contact. Okay,
Thank you so much for organizing this. And as folks are leading, if there's any way you want to support stuff, just keep reading things from like younger scholars who are like, trying to start their own publications, and subscribe to Corona Borealis.
Yes, yes. I was going to plug your site. Read Corona Borealis. It's absolutely great. And yes, thank you to the Christian Cult Society. Thank you, Shreya and Ray. And everyone for all the work that you've done. This has been a really enjoyable discussion and a huge honor.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'll end the Zoom now. Thank you all. Bye.